Okay, good day. We're glad to welcome you on the second webinar, Introduction to Logotherapy. And I will remind you that my name is Nino Berzinishvili. I am president of Caucasus Association of Logotherapy and Existential Analysis. And we're happy to have the opportunity to welcome our honored guest speaker, Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cohen, director of the Institute of Judaism and Civilization in Melbourne, Australia, academic and researcher, the professor of Monash University, one of the leading universities in Australia. We urge you to be active, ask and write questions, and share your insights. Thank you, and welcome once again.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, the topic for tonight's talk is Viktor Frankl's own intellectual path to logotherapy. And I think this path itself tells us a lot about what logotherapy is. Well, let's start with Frankl's youth. Now, Frankl's path to logotherapy was both an intellectual and a spiritual one. These two aspects, the intellectual and the spiritual, went hand in hand. Frankl was born into a traditional Jewish family which practiced the basics of Orthodox Jewish faith. In his later adolescence, he experienced the loss of faith. Now, together with this went his early connection with the circle and the teaching of Sigmund Freud. Okay, so now the connection between his loss of the faith of his parental home, and the newfound intellectual attachment to Freud is understandable. Freud held that the human instincts, namely the sexual instincts, but also aggressive and narcissistic instincts, were the primary determinants of human psychological behavior. In Freudian theory, the gratification and release of these instincts were the source of mental health, and the frustration or the inhibition of these instincts were the source of neurosis and mental ill health. Now, Freud's concept that impulse and instinct were the drivers and the basis of personality represent what Frankl later came to call a reductionism. This word reductionism comes from the word to reduce something, to bring everything back to something else. By reductionism, he meant the attempt to reduce human personality to a single cause or factor, which was held to determine human behavior. Frankl, at this early stage, evidently agreed with Freud, and this sits together with his own irreligiosity, his lack of faith, his abandonment of faith at this time, which presumably downgraded the sense of the spirit or the soul. So it's understandable, basically, that a person in whom the religious sense has subsided, has gone away, will be ready to look more at the material, the instinctual basis of personality. Now, Frankl would later describe Freud's reductionism as being opposed to the idea of human freedom. For, as noted in the first lecture, Frankl came to explain that freedom exists only where the human being has a choice to make between listening to conscience on the one hand, or to drives arising within the personality on the other. Conscience, therefore, confers freedom because it enables the person to decide on moral grounds whether to accept, reject, or modify drives, be they from impulse or perception. The two key concepts of freedom and responsibility, which, as we discussed last time, are integral to Frankl's later logotherapy, are both missing in Frankl's early thought. This is the time when he was an adherent, a student and a disciple of Freud. Although Freud had accepted the young Frankl as a protege and published a writing of Frankl in his psychoanalytic journal, Frankl soon became dissatisfied with Freud's narrow basis of human personality, primarily in human sexuality, that everything was reduced to this one dimension. It seems that at this point, whilst not yet fully returning to his childhood faith, Frankl was beginning to contemplate further dimensions of human personality. He begins to mention among them the human spirit. Frankl left the Freudian school to join that of another major figure in Viennese psychology, Alfred Adler, who himself had left Freud's circle. Adler was also dissatisfied with Freud's basing human personality on human sexuality. So just to summarize briefly, Freud reduced human personality to the bodily or instinctual dimension. And whilst Frankl initially went along with this and accepted it, and as I said before, it went together with the fact that he was not religious in this early phase of his life, nevertheless, he came to see it as narrow. And he came to reject it in the same way as Alfred Adler rejected it. Well, what then was the, what then, and he became, if you like, it would seem, well, I don't know whether he became somewhat attached to Alfred Adler. Now, Alfred Adler founded what was known as the School of Individual Psychology. In contrast to Freud's focus on the instinctual basis of human personality, Adler sees the human being essentially as a social being. According to Adler, the psychological need and fulfillment of the human being comes about through the human being's need for some kind of mastery. And that mastery could be a mastery, a successful, a fully functioning position or participation in the life of society, in society, in work, and in human relationships. Correspondingly, for Adler, the sources of psychological ill health were the failures of the individual to participate in a masterful, in a strong, in a powerful way in society, including successful work engagement and family and family relations and in work. So that, for example, the so-called inferiority complex, the person's sense of inadequacy and inferiority in any of these spheres becomes therefore the motivator to compensate these and to achieve a degree of mastery in these various realms. So similarly, the healthy individual in Adler's view is a person who was accomplishing goals, who was primarily goal-oriented and goal-accomplishing. In other words, it was a question of the individual as a successful part of the social whole, which characterized mental health. Okay, now Frankl, in fact, would later see Adler's work also as a form of reductionism. So whilst, to use Frankl's terminology, whilst Freud reduced human personality to a instinctual or biological level, Adler reduced human personality to, if you like, what he called a sociologism. In other words, a need for effective social participation, a need for some kind of mastery in his or her roles within work, society, and family. Or so that is to say, Frank said for Frankl, Adler replaced Freud's biologism with his own sociologism, which means to a social or a societal need. Now, for Frankl, both of these schools were deniers of freedom and responsibility, because once again, they are both of them, whether it's Adler or whether it's Freud, they are both reducing human personality to a single dimension. Now, okay, so this meant, in other words, that neither of Freud nor Adler had the sense of conscience or spiritual reflection or need or purpose as a counterweight or as a counterbalance to this to what they regarded as the dominant dimension of human existence. In Freud's case, instinct, and in Adler's case, the concept of the need for the human being to accomplish a kind of mastery within society and within social roles. So it's interesting to reflect on Frankl's progression from Freud to Adler, and then to his own early beginnings of logotherapy in the pre-Second World War years. We could say that in each of these stages of Frankl's work, and this I think is a very interesting point, this is why it's valuable to trace Frankl's development, he is focusing on another of the dimensions of human personality. Now, let's just reiterate this. What are the dimensions of human personality in Frankl's model? So they are, first of all, as we mentioned before, the bodily or the emotional or the biological level of personality. Secondly, the mental or perceptual level of personality. And thirdly, the noetic or the meaning faculty. Now, interestingly, Frankl's development goes from one to the other till finally he gets to the third noetic faculty of personality, the meaning dimension of personality. As we said, the first, the bodily, emotional, instinctual level, that's the primary focus of Freud's psychology. It has to do with biological and primarily sexual impulses and instincts, desires and needs. It seeks gratification of these instincts and impulses. The second level, the mental level, has to do with the mind's strategic relationship to others. But that is to say, both to its own instinctual self and its wider environment. Now, it's very interesting to note that Alfred Adler In fact, well, on the one, Adler said that he had what he called a holistic view of human personality. He didn't like the way in which Freud separated out the instincts from the other the instincts from the other dimensions of personality and gave them dominance. But in fact, when we look at Adler's work, Adler is in fact focused on the mental dimension, the dimension which Freud would have called ego, because Adler understands human existence as being primarily concerned with strategic or goal-oriented behavior. Adler says that the division of labor in society, in fact, the concept of social cooperation, is the mechanism, so to speak, of as the mechanism of human survival. In other words, to exist, to survive, the human being must cooperate with other people, and this essentially is an organizational, a strategic faculty of human personality. Just as we see in Freudian theory, that the role of the ego is to manage the id, is to manage impulses, and also to engage in relationships with others, and to relate the emotional self to the critique of intellect, in other words, to strategize and to examine the consequences and to delay gratification. So therefore, this ego function, this mental function, is one which is primarily, if you like, a organizing, strategizing, a faculty which accomplishes the human being's survival as an individual and as a collectivity. But it is, and so therefore it's not focused like Freud's is on the instinctual level. It's to the contrary. It is about organization. It's about group survival. It's about group participation and successful group participation. And but this still is primarily the mental function, as distinct from the instinctual or the noetic meaning function. And when Adler looks at human behavior as goal-oriented, he's not really interested in what the goals are per se. Rather, the fact is that the person has a goal and achieves the goal. It's about the achievement of the goal. It's about the strategic. It's about the strategic, organizational accomplishment of goals. So that is, if you like, the social basis of personality in Adler's work. And that's essentially what intellect, what ego is distinct from it does. It's concerned with relations to one's emotional self, with relations to others, with relations to nature, and so on and so forth. It's a relational dimension, an organizational relation. So in a sense, therefore, that is, in his movement from Freud to Adler, Frankl has gone from a focus on the instinctual bodily dimension to the mental social dimension. But then when he's dissatisfied also with Adler, he begins to move then now to the noetic, to the meaning seeking, the highest dimension of the human personality. So it's after Adler, after Frankl departs from Adler, just as he departed from Freud, that he comes now to focus on this third dimension of personality. Now we must remember, and we'll say that Frankl doesn't discard these other dimensions of personality. He doesn't say they don't exist. They are, to use his words, co-determining. But what Frankl will now say is that together with this emotional, together with this intellectual dimension of personality, goes a yet higher dimension, which is the meaning dimension, the noetic dimension. And it's this third faculty of personality, which logotherapy is particularly concerned with, and which it situates as the ultimate and the sovereign power of human personality. That means the first two dimensions of personality, the somatic or the bodily emotional, and the second, the mental or the psychological faculty, these then become for Frankl vehicles for the highest, the meaning faculty of personality, which ultimately has the ability to control and to organize these lower faculties, or at least has to grapple with them. Okay, so that's the trajectory, if you like, of Frankl's work. He's gone from the somatic to the mental to the noetic, and it's all, these are stages, so to speak, in his own movement towards logotherapy, this formation of logotherapy. Now, let's look and see now how Frankl's experience in the Holocaust crystallized logotherapy. So, as we mentioned in the first lecture, it was in his own experience of the concentration camps during the Holocaust that Frankl's formulation of logotherapy was finally crystallized and completed. So this came also now with the fuller return of his faith and commitment to a life lived by conscience. So just as Frankl is beginning to assert the role of the noetic, the spirit, he himself is returning to faith. This is an important development. So I want to illustrate now a couple of experiences which Frankl had in the shadow of the Holocaust and in the Holocaust itself, which show how this logotherapeutic stance of the concept of the importance and the existence of conscience arises and becomes dominant within his own work. So these are personal stories of Frankl, which Frankl himself tells. And one of these stories relates to the time just before the Second World War. It refers to the Anschluss, or the German annexation of Austria, and the other relates to an experience which Frankl had when he'd already been deported to the concentration camps. Now, the first story relates to the time when in Vienna, after the German annexation and Nazification of Austria in 1938, Frankl made plans to emigrate to the United States of America. After finally receiving a visa to America, Frankl then began to reconsider whether he should leave behind his elderly parents who did not have visas and were not able to leave Austria in the face of the growing Nazi danger. On the night of the 9th to the 10th of November, 1938, there occurred throughout Germany and Austria a pogrom against the Jews known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Apart from thousands of Jewish businesses, about 1,000 synagogues were attacked and burned. Preoccupied with the question of whether he should leave his parents in Austria, Frankl recalls that following Kristallnacht, after the night of this pogrom, the next morning or the next day, he was walking amongst the rubble of a destroyed synagogue in Vienna. In it, he saw and picked up a fragment of a replica of the stone tablets which had in it the 10 Commandments we know that Moses received the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. And it was customary that in many Jewish synagogues, you would have a representation of these 2 tablets in which were engraved the 10 Commandments. And they were also quite often also made of stone, like the original 10 Commandments were tablets of stone. Now, when he was walking around amongst the ruins of a burnt synagogue in Vienna that next morning, he saw a fragment of broken stone. And this was evidently a fragment from 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, which had been placed in that synagogue. And on that fragment was the first letter of the 5th commandment, which is honor your mother, honor your father and mother, to honor parents. The fact is, he picked up that little stone which had the first letter of that, a little fragment which had the first letter of that command. He responded to this by seeing in this an indication of divine providence, that God was telling him something, namely that he must not leave his parents behind in Austria. He gave up his own visa to America, stayed in Vienna with his parents, and was later taken and sent to the death camps. So this dramatic story illustrates Frankl's view that we are supposed to view the moments of our lives as lived before the call of a higher purpose. Whether we call this God, or we call it life, or we call it history. From this standpoint, the meanings or values or good deeds that we actualize through these challenges are eternal. They cannot be taken. What does he mean by eternal? They cannot be taken away from us. They are something, it is a good deed from the standpoint of eternity, from the standpoint of God. So let me just, all right. So it is this transcendent challenge to which our own self-transcending spirit responds, whether we call this God, life, or history, which is illustrated in this story of the stone fragment which Frankl found and upon which he made his decision. Now, the fact that a person can sometimes also make a wrong decision, a decision which one regrets, an undesirable decision. And that to be human is to make bad decisions as well as good decisions. But this does not take away from the good that I have done. Rather, the future remains open for me to learn from my mistakes and to do more good. Above all, above everything else is the importance of the present. And Frankl calls the present moment the border zone of eternity. In it, we can now achieve an immortally good deed, word, or thought, however big or small. That's essentially what that's where conscience places us. Conscience places us in a, if you like, it places us in a transcendent standpoint and gives us a sense of the transcendence of our good deeds, that our deeds live on. Our good deed is something which lives forever. It cannot be taken from us. It is something which is, in a sense, higher. It belongs and it relates to something greater than the human being himself or herself, and it's an eternal accomplishment which a person can make. That's the first story, the story of the stone fragment. A second story is told by Frankl about himself when he was already in the concentration camps. Frankl had brought with him into the camp the manuscript or notes for a book which he hoped to write after the war. when he believed and prayed and hoped that he would be liberated. It was this hope, the hope of eventually being able to write this book, he said, which kept him from suicide amongst all the despair and horror of the death camp. He had sewed these notes, or this written outline of the book, into the lining of his coat, which he trusted would keep it safe. One day, the Nazi guards in the camp ordered a group of inmates, which included Frankl, to strip off the clothes which they had worn into the camp. At that moment, when Frankl's coat, together with the manuscript of the book sewn into it, was taken away from him, he was faced with the question of whether his life had lost all meaning and purpose. He himself was tempted by suicidal thoughts. Frankl writes what happened next, and now I'm quoting Frankl's own words. Frankl says, "In exchange for my clothes, I was given the rags of an inmate, fellow inmate, who had already been sent to the gas chamber. In a pocket, I found a single page torn from a Hebrew prayer book. It contained the prayer with the command, 'Love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might.' Or, as one could interpret it as well, the command to say yes to life, despite whatever one has to face, be it suffering or even die. A life, I told myself, whose meaning stands or falls on whether one can publish a manuscript, would ultimately not be a life worth living. Thus, in that single page, which replaced the many pages of my manuscript, I saw a symbolic call from now on to live my thoughts instead of merely putting them on paper." Now, this is something which is very significant, because we have to remember that Frankl himself was an intellectual, and he could put aside other emotional and mental needs, but this had been his whole world. The ideas, the book that he wanted to publish. But we see here that the call of self-transcendence requires one to suspend even something spiritual, even something purposeful, even a meaning. In other words, to subordinate oneself and one's perceived interests to a higher calling under all circumstances, even when one considers that one's interest is something very worthy, but maybe it is being challenged. And that should not be a reason why one gives away one's life, because one still has to ask, if I can't do this, well, what then am I called to? So the story documents what self-transcendence means for a person. Self-transcendence signifies the transcendence of all interests or biases which arise in every and any aspect of one's personal being. These could be bodily emotional interests. And Frankl, we see, left Freud because Freud could not give the human being freedom against these interests. They could be mental or psychological interests. And Frankl left Adler because Adler could not grant the human freedom against the social need which the human being had for power and acceptance. Logotherapy, on the other hand, granted the individual the power to rise above both emotional and mental interests, because it acknowledged a spiritual faculty which was sovereign and higher than both of these. Finally, in this story of the death camps, we see that Frankl was able to extend self-transcendence even to meaning itself. Even if the meaning to which one is held is challenged, that doesn't mean that one has lost one's purpose in existence. He was willing to suspend even his own previously held guiding purpose, the purpose he had in the lost manuscript, which was in fact realized and published after the war as The Doctor and the Soul. This was the manuscript of The Doctor and the Soul, which he in fact was able to publish. He was in fact successful. Obviously, he must have reconstructed it from memory, but this was the book he did manage to publish. But in that moment, he said, if I can't do this, I still have a reason to live. I still have a purpose. Even though right now I may not grasp that purpose, but under all circumstances, there is a reason and there is a purpose in my existence, and I must seek it. Thus, Frankl uncovered the essence of human self-transcendence, which is the conscience or the soul, as that which has no interest other than to do what life calls upon it to do here and now. Whilst Frankl himself experienced this in explicitly religious terms, his logotherapy sought to teach self-transcendence also to the non-religious person, even the person who considered himself an agnostic or an atheist. For logotherapy, as we shall discuss in a later lecture, regards self-transcendence as available to everyone. Frankl acknowledged that the philosophical and reflective character of logotherapy by itself might not be sufficient to cure psychological problems such as trauma, anxiety, not to mention deeper conditions such as schizophrenia, so on, which have a somatic basis. Nevertheless, as I hope to show in the next lecture, logotherapy remains a vital supplement to the specific therapies which treat these conditions. It is crucial because it awakens and draws upon the deepest resource of the human being, which is the morally deciding spiritual self. And this is something which is indestructible and which is always healthy and is the deepest human resource. Well, that's my background. That's essentially what I have to say today, but I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for sharing this inspiring story of Viktor Frankl's life, the concept of logotherapy and vision of 3 dimensions of personality. And let me ask you a question. I think it will be interesting for our audience who will view this webinar after. How can you explain that logotherapy does not lose its relevance, but also becomes an increasingly popular direction? The world is changing now, but the human needs in meaning still remains relevant.
Well, the answer is that our society, well, it depends where. In some places it's more than in others, has forgotten that the human being has a soul. And that spiritual dimension has been submerged or repressed. But it's the deeper, under all circumstances, it is a reality. It can be dormant, it can be sleeping within the human being, it can be unconscious. And I think the characteristic of the current age, particularly in the West, has been the complete suppression, the complete dormancy, the latency of the spiritual dimension. So, in other words, it's not something which it's timeless. It is the principal human faculty, and it's it's novel only because it's been forgotten. And does that answer you? Does that answer your question?
Yes, fully. Thank you. Any other questions?
I see there's something in the chat. There's something coming up in the chat there. I can't.
Thank heaven, Sigmund Freud was spread knowing concentration camps from the inside. His subject lay on a couch designed in the plush style of Victorian culture. Right.
Freud, of course, got out of Austria, and he got out of Austria in 1938 before the Kristallnacht.
Yes,
And
Freud
and if I'm not mistaken, I think he died in 1938 too. But that's true. He didn't see any of that. As a matter of fact, in later lectures, I want to show a very interesting thing, and that is that even though Frankl, of course, he repudiated the determinism, the biological determinism of Freud, he still regarded Freud as a giant, the greatest psychological classic, and he makes a special use of Freud, or he wanted to make, he sought very much to utilize Freud in conjunction with logotherapy. But that's I'm going to talk about that in a later lecture. But as for Adler, I don't know if he ever came back to anything in Adler. I'm sure he saw Freud as much greater than Adler. But Adler's work still has some influence today, but I don't think it's not a major school from what I can see.
Yes, we have a raised hand. Yes.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for your explanation. It was really great, precisely about Freud, Adler, and Frankl. I have two questions. One of them is about Friedrich Nietzsche. I know that I'm linking to the philosophers. In the previous lecture also I linked to another philosopher. I want to say, like, Nietzsche has influenced these three psychologists, even Freud, Adler, and also Frankl, as I know. About the power, I think it's much more Adler interprets Nietzsche's, Freud interpret muchly instincts from Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's ideas, but I think the Frankl interpret mostly the meaning, or what Nietzsche was disagreed with previous philosophers, those pessimist philosophers previously, that he was telling them they are preachers of death. They want another life, and they are not saying this life good, and they want to dash this life to go to another life. This is my first question, that how you interpret Nietzsche's and Frankl together. And my second question is that about Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. I know that it is very different, his ideas about collective unconscious and those ideas, but I think his therapy, like the way that he was doing the therapy with all of his patients, he was also has a insight on the meaning. In such of his training session and his notes, he mentioned that the way that he had a meaning, or also when he was working with the psychotic patients, he was telling that those psychotic patients has such a meaning that they got in that, holistic or in the deep, dark caves. And I'm going to put the light on those dark cave to find it. These are my two questions, and I want to know how these Frankl's ideas get with the Nietzsche's and also the Carl Gustav Jung's. Thank you.
Well, I first of all, I read Nietzsche a long time ago, and also Jung, I have some acquaintance, but not a great deal. But I will tell you what I know. Now, first of all, Nietzsche, of course, is ultimately an anti-religious thinker, but of course he focuses very much on the will. Now, there's a famous statement. I think it may come from Nietzsche, is that wherever there is whenever there is a will to do something, there is a way, there is a how to do it. Now, certainly, Frankl took over, believed in the power of human will. Now, in theology, but the interesting question is, well, where is the will, and what is the will, and which will are we talking about? So, you could say that this term "will" could be character. Freud could have used the concept of will, because it could have been in terms of the will, the desire for instinctual gratification. Certainly, Adler could have used this concept of will in terms of the goal orientation of the human being, and that the human being is oriented towards social mastery. In other words, to successful participation as a social member, as a member of society, etc. That's also a will. Frankl's concept of will is a concept of will which is linked and related to the noetic, to this noetic faculty. And in my opinion, this is actually one of the most powerful expressions of will, because the spiritual sense of will has a greater power and a greater potential power than any other form of will, because it is the noetic function, which is the sovereign dimension in the human being anyway, because in other words, that it is that the human being, it ultimately justifies or rationalizes their impulses and their perceptions. They have to find some kind of a meaning. The question is, and very often the meaning which they find is just a rationalization of their own interests. When, however, the noetic function is working by itself, not simply because it's responding to the need of emotion or mind. So then you have the spirit, then you have what's called that purely spiritual will. Now, that, I believe, is a stronger will than the other kinds of will. And it's not only, it's one reason is because it's associated with the stronger faculty, which is the noetic faculty, but also because there is in the spirit a greater power. There in the spirit, there is this ability. This is the primary locus, the primary place of self-transcendence. And if a person, particularly in the camps, what is it that gave people the ability to survive psychologically and humanly? Was the spiritual transcendence. It is the strongest will which the human being possesses. So to answer about Nietzsche, yes, there's will here and there's will there. But in Frankl, the will has a different, the will is linked. The will that we're talking about is a will that Nietzsche did not really understand. It's the will of the soul, the will of the conscience, the determination and the resolve of the conscience. That's the will. So, and as for Jung, now Jung developed various kinds of psychological archetypes, but Frankl says about Jung, why does Jung have to go now and invent, so to speak, these basic these basic constructs of meaning when they are already there in world religion? In other words, he says that, I think his critique of Jung is to say that Jung doesn't look at the living tradition of faith itself. The living tradition of faith is itself that with which the human soul is connected. And that's what we do when we speak about the soul. We're speaking about a culture of faith which has gone on for thousands and thousands of years. You don't have to invent something new. It's there already. So As I say, I'm not very well acquainted with Jung's work, but I know that Frankl says this about Jung. He says that Jung is inventing various kinds of cultural archetypes and so on and so forth, meaning archetypes, when they're already there in human religious experience. And we need, and that's why one needs to tap into the spiritual tradition of humanity as it is. Look into its texts, look into its language, and there you will find the actual language of the soul. Okay, so that doesn't mean, as I said before, that Frankl's going to require everybody to be religious, because it's not practical, it's not therapeutically efficacious. But Frankl says that the spiritual language, the language of the soul, we don't have to invent it. It's already there in religious tradition. As we say. I hope I don't know if I've answered your question to some. I hope I have partly answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And another comments in the chat. Tyson comments the line by Nietzsche that Frankl quotes, "He who has a why can bear anyhow." Yes, indeed.
That's right. Thank you for the exact quotation. That's what I had in mind. So once again, he's taken over he's used the phrase from Nietzsche, but he's used it he's referring to something really different. It's a different kind of a will. That is a character of will, but which will? And I mean, a person can have a tremendous will to be a success in business, or a tremendous will to achieve something material, but that's not the kind of will. That's not meaning in the sense that Frankl discussed.
Thank you. And another comment from Tyson. The quote about having to live his beliefs rather than write to them reminds me of Kierkegaard's criticizing Hegel by saying he made a system and sat down beside it. Curious to hear any of your thoughts comparing the existentialism of Kierkegaard with that of Frankl.
I have to say, I have some acquaintance with Kierkegaard. You're testing me on my philosophical knowledge here. I am aware to some extent of Kierkegaard, but I'll have to suspend the answer to that question until I go back and look into it. Maybe I can answer that question at a later lecture, but if you give me notice. But I really need to prepare the answer to that question. Sorry. It's a good question. I can see it's a good question, but to answer it in an informed way, I'll have to prepare. Perhaps you can, if you can copy me that question, Nino, and email it to me.
Sure,
I'll be able to consider it later. All right.
Sure. Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? I saw that there is no need to translate or summarize this webinar. Everything is understandable.
I'm happy. That's good. So, like, maybe I can ask a question. How is logotherapy being received culturally in your countries?
Oh, it's a very good question. Is it
something new, or does it fit well?
It's a very good question. I will transfer this question to our participants because they are participants from different countries. And then I will answer from Georgia. Farham, maybe you can comment.
Yes, I'm from Iran, and the things that I know, the psychotherapy, the popular psychotherapy that is happening in Iran is one of them is the psychodynamic psychotherapy, and another one is the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy. And I believe that they are looking to the humans as a machines. the way that they are looking at the techniques. And I have a contact with the psychological students, and they are looking to the humans as like a machine, and they just learning the techniques from the books, and they are not have such a insight to work with the existential philosophy or even the logotherapy. And they thought that if they know those techniques, those instruments, and they can apply those instruments in the therapeutic room, then everything is going to be solved. And yeah, because of that, I think that it is such a critical moment in Iran, as I think, and I hope that is going to be changed. Yes, this is my comment about the things that are happening in Iran.
May I say, could I ask you please to give me your email address that I could communicate with you at a later point?
For sure.
Nino, can you facilitate that, please?
Yes, of course.
Because I would like to pursue that discussion.
I'm glad so much.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to keep people waiting. If there's no more questions, then for now, then we'll go to next week. We'll continue, please goodness.
Okay.
And I want to speak next week about logotherapy as a supplementary therapy, something which goes together with psychotherapy. Anyway, sorry, unless there was another question now. Let me just read that question. Can you read it out to me? The question came up in the chat just now. I didn't see it.
Yes, 1 minute. Can you offer any hypothesis as to why Frankl is not as well known? Despite being extremely original, I feel he is often overlooked.
It's a wonderful question. And the answer is Frankl is extremely well known amongst in what we call grassroots culture. In other words, his book, Man's Search for Meaning, was enormously popular and disseminated. So, so I think that they made a survey, they found it was one of the 10 most read books in America, whatever it is, or the most but the academic world rejected it. Now, why? Why did the academic world reject it? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is academic hubris. In other words, academics, unfortunately, there's a danger in being an academic, and that is that academics very often are so impressed with their own intelligence, and they forget that they're human, that they're mortal. There is it is very hard for an academic, for an intellectual, to practice self-transcendence. Just as, in other words, the second story I told about Frankl, that a person like Frankl, an intellectual like him, could say, if my whole life depends on publishing a book, then what kind of a life is that? In other words, yeah, to be able to suspend everything, including one's own ideas, in the face of a challenge, of a higher calling. So I think it's been said that Frankl's work is in the background of a great deal of contemporary psychology. A lot of humanistic psychology takes him on, but for some reason he first of all he started out, Freudianism was very strong in his early academic years, and that was very hostile to Frankl's kind of work, as you can imagine. But I think that the problem, that the challenge which Frankl poses to academia is the challenge which the soul poses to contemporary civilization. People resist it, and that's the problem. But when society becomes religious, Frankl will be very popular.
I can add also that Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is very popular in Georgia as well. It became bestseller here also, and I hope we can translate his other books. And here is comment from Fatima. I think it is also because another methods are pushed by money. Maybe.
By money, you mean
Yes.
research funding and so on? Is that what you mean, or
Yeah,
do you mean?
yes, marketing? I mean,
Yeah,
maybe.
could well be.
Mhm.
Well,
And may I ask, what is your story? I address this question to our audience. What is your story? How you discovered Frankl for yourself? Maybe you can share a couple of sentences. How you discover logotherapy or Frankl?
Answer of this question.
Thank you.
Yes, during COVID, exactly. I think it was a first or second month of the COVID duration. I saw in the social media that one of my friends suggested the book for the public, and I started to read it. And it has been affected me on that moment. It was very difficult for me because everything has been banned. I was in Georgia at that time, and I had a terror feeling. And this book really helped me. And after that, I start to read a Plague book by the Camus. The Camus book also it helped me, and I entered to the existential philosophy at that time. Yeah, one of the famous person was Frankl to guide me to get inside of the existential philosophy.
Thank you
Frankl
very
is
much.
positive existentialism, and Camus is negative existentialism.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And also, I remember our first meeting with Parham. I was giving a lecture at Tbilisi State University. It was about Frankl, his life, about logotherapy, and he was with his friend, and his friend was translating to him from Georgian to English.
There you are.
So thank you very much. I'm glad to see you.
Good.
And Tyson writes, 1 minute. I think in my first undergraduate year, while simultaneously watching lectures from Jordan Peterson, he mentioned it, read Man's Search for Meaning over 2 nights, and then watched several others and delved deeper. Okay, thank you very much for sharing your stories about discovering Frankl. And thank you very much, Dr. Cowan, for this webinar, for your interesting lecture, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you. And I must say, I'm enjoying getting to know all of you individually to some extent. I hope we can continue a number of links. And please, if you could, I would, as requested, I'd be grateful to have those 2 things, the question about Kierkegaard, and also, is it Parham? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, sir. My name is.
Yeah. And also his email address. And I hope that I'll get to know the others better as well individually later. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
All the very best till next week. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.